In the early morning hours of June 1st, 2009, an air traffic controller working at Cape Verde, an island nation off the coast of West Africa, noticed something strange. He was expecting an Air France flight, which was due in from Rio de Janeiro that morning, heading across the Atlantic for Paris. But there was nothing on his radar screen. So, wondering what was up, he called the controller in the next sector over, a sector called Dakar, which is out of Senegal. So the Cape Verde controller called Senegal and asked if he had any information on this flight. The Senegal controller said no, he had no information, but that he assumed that nothing was wrong and that the flight was probably just delayed. Now, I should point out that Senegal doesn't have radar that extends into the center of the Atlantic. Instead, it relies on a system called ADS-C. And this is a system by which computers aboard each aircraft transmit location information up to a satellite and then down into the central system. If there's a problem with the logon, if the computer aboard the plane can't communicate with the satellite system, then the air traffic control computer on the ground creates a virtual symbol of the plane based on the flight plan that had been filed previously. So what the Senegalese controller was seeing was a symbol for Air France 447 on his screen, but it was based on an assumption that the flight plan was being followed. So Senegal said to Cape Verde, everything is fine. I see no grounds for concern. So he hung up. 10 minutes went by. Cape Verde still didn't see any airplane that correlated to Air France 447 on his radar screen. So he called Senegal back up. Have you received any further information, he asked. Senegal said no, and admitted that in fact he hadn't had any communication whatsoever with Air France 447. Prompted by Cape Verde, he called the air traffic control center in Brazil, where the last flight information region where the plane had presumably been. And the controllers in Brazil said that they hadn't had any communication with Air France 447 since just prior to their leaving Brazilian airspace about 3 hours before. Now, people began to get worried. Phone calls were made between air traffic control centers, between French authorities, between Air France. No one knew where Air France 447 was. And as minutes went by, hours went by, the grim truth became increasingly clear that Air France 447, somewhere over the Atlantic, was missing. And as time went by, the plane reached the limits of what it theoretically could have reached with its stores of fuel on board. It was clear that wherever it was no longer in the air. And so the question became, what happened to Air France 447? The answer to that question took days to begin to answer before the first wreckage was found floating in the middle of the Atlantic. And it took years to piece together a complete solution. And only earlier this month, the French aviation authorities finally released the last report detailing all of the findings that they were able to make. And this is extraordinary in this day and age, that an airliner, a $100 million aircraft, the epitome of sophistication and engineering, should simply vanish from radar screens, vanish from the knowledge of human beings. And it really points out to one of the most fascinating, troubling, disturbing, tragic, and dramatic events that's happened in air crash investigation in our era. And I think it's worth looking at. That's what I'd like to talk to you about today, to review the findings of the French aviation authorities and to see what we can learn, what the implications are for civil aviation and for all of us who are pilots, what we can learn from this strange and troubling accident. So let's just start with the basics. This is an Air France Airbus A330. It was only a few years old. This was an utterly routine flight. This plane itself had just returned from Paris, and typical turnaround time of just a few hours. The flight crew, of course, was changed. The flight crew consisted of 3 pilots, a captain, and 2 first officers. Very experienced, well-trained crew working for a very prestigious airline. This is a top-notch, grade A team of aviators with more than 20,000 hours of experience between them. So nothing that happened in the subsequent few hours can be attributed to shoddiness in that regard. So, May 31st, 2009, 7:30 p.m. local time, the plane lifts off from Rio de Janeiro, follows a great circle route north towards Paris. It skirts along the coast, the eastern coast of Brazil, as it climbs towards its assigned altitude of 35,000 feet. It's going to cross the South Atlantic, across the equator, skirt the coast of Africa, cross Spain, and then across France, to arrive in Paris some 11 hours later, the next morning, June 1st. Now, as it leaves Rio, it enters the Recife flight information region. The flight data recorder begins recording about midnight, universal time. And I'm going to just use Zulu time right from now on. It enters the last area of radar coverage. Obviously, radar has finite range, and so in the middle of the Atlantic, there is no radar coverage. As I mentioned earlier, to know a plane's position when it's so far out of the ocean, you require this satellite automatic reporting system, ADS-C. So, aboard, in the left seat is the captain, Marc Dubois. In the right seat is the junior of the 2 first officers, Pierre-Cédric Bonin. The other is taking a rest. And at 1 hour 33 minutes, they pass the Intal waypoint. They cross from Recife to Atlantico. And they talk to the Atlantico controllers. They report their estimated time of arrival at some subsequent waypoints. The controllers ask them another question and they don't answer. And we don't know why. They might have just not heard it. But at any rate, this is the final transmission that they will make with air traffic control. Now, they're heading north towards a unique weather phenomenon which astrides the equator. It's called the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And this is a phenomenon that arises where the northern trade winds meet the southern trade winds. They sort of collide head-on, and they lift upwards. Now, given that the air in this region is generally pretty warm and pretty moist, you can imagine this presents ripe conditions for the creation of thunderstorms. And indeed, this area is known for severe, intense thunderstorms, CBs that rise up to 50,000 feet and can create very negative weather conditions. Sailors once called this area the doldrums. So it's been kind of a problem for a long time. Now, as it happens, now there's not always storms in the doldrums, but here you can see that it's a pretty steady and reliable phenomenon. Now, as it happens, and this is an image taken from satellite weather showing some cloud tops and areas of intense vertical development. And as we can see, the flight path is heading right for first some small stuff and then some very heavy stuff. Now, at the same time, there's several other flights that are heading from South America to Europe along similar routes. And their positions are being recorded, and they're following trajectories kind of like this. And you can see when the trajectories are played back that they tend to do things like this. They go around it. But Air France 447, as we know from the cockpit transcriptions, they're not really thinking too much about avoiding the weather. In fact, as the plane is approaching this weather, the junior of the first officers, Bonin, expresses some concern. He wonders if they're able to climb. But the weather is unusually warm, more warm than forecast. And because warm air is less dense air offers less performance for the airplane. The airplane is unable to climb. And so the captain, who seems relatively unconcerned about this, just says, well, we're fine where we are. So obviously there's not a lot of concern about the severity, potential impact of the weather that they're heading towards. So at about 1:50, this is about 17 minutes after the last transmission, 10 minutes to 2 o'clock Universal Time, they pass through some minor turbulence, as I indicated on the last slide. Now, again, Bonin sounds anxious. Dubois ignores his concerns. A phenomenon occurs at this time in the cockpit called St. Elmo's fire. And I've personally never experienced this, but it's an electrical discharge caused by high concentrations of static electricity. It's a phenomenon that's associated with intense thunderstorms. So it could be beautiful if you look at it that way. It could be sort of troubling and bizarre if you're not used to it, or if it signals something bad. Sailors, getting back to the old days sailors, when sailors would see this sort of thing, they regarded it with some superstition. Dubois calmly explains what it is, and they go about their flight. 5 minutes later, the captain, so unconcerned that he decides that he's going to take a nap and retreat to the crew cabin, the captain wakes up Robert by intercom, and he gives up his left-hand seat. In doing so, he leaves Bonin, the junior of the two first officers, as the pilot flying. So he's now at the controls of the airplane. Robert takes the left-hand seat, but is designated pilot not flying. So he's there to assist. Now, around this time, this is when they try to log on to the ATSC system with Dakar. They're unable to. The computer in Dakar rejects the logon password for whatever reason. So fatefully now they've left radar. They are about to leave Brazilian airspace to go out on a 3-hour flight over the center of the Atlantic with no radar coverage and no ATSC. So they are now leaving the eyes and ears of civilization, as it were.